Hi there, I'm Kim Vanel. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera. Your look at the world of business and economics. This week, record-breaking temperatures and ferocious wildfires. Scientists warn Europe is becoming a heatwave hotspot. So how can the continent adapt to the extreme weather conditions? And at what cost? Also this week, the world needs to burn less fossil fuels to slow climate change. But are developing nations getting the funds they need to switch to renewable energy? And back to the skies. As the travel industry recovers some of the pandemic losses, we look at the demand for the obvious essential, aircraft, at the UK's Farnborough Air Show. Researchers estimate heat waves have shaved an average 0.5% off Europe's annual GDP in the past 10 years. In 2022, the losses could be even greater. To list just a few of the factors, much of Western Europe is sweltering under record-breaking temperatures. Wildfires are sweeping across Italy, Greece, France and Spain, destroying crops. And energy prices are up because of the war in Ukraine. Zain Basravi has this report from Tabara in northern Spain.
When the inferno came, farmers in Zamora became firefighters. My God, he says, I'm all alone. In remote areas like this, there is no time to wait for a rescue crew. You have to save yourself. The wind whips up the flames in every direction. It is easy to find yourself surrounded.
That came out of nowhere.
Come on, go.
Days later, Manuel tills charred soil, putting out any remaining embers.
We had help, but from other farmers in the area. The local government didn't help us at all. It's very nice to come after the fire and say we will pay for all of this, but the time to help us is when the fire is here.
The blaze burned crops, destroyed infrastructure, and left behind economic uncertainty. Fires in this part of the country may be under control for now, but there is still smoke hanging in the air. You can see it obscuring the landscape. You can even smell it. For the people living here and for those fire rescue teams that are based here in Tabara, these are ever-present reminders that the wildfire season is far from over. For 3 generations, Yolanda Mayo Julian's family has lived and worked on this land. She watched their barn go up in flames in minutes. Taking stock, she says they don't know how they'll be able to recover.
I've never seen anything like this before. The fire came very quickly with a lot of wind. It was just relentless. We could do absolutely nothing. It's still going. It still has a lot of power.
There used to be hundreds of animals here. Most were moved, but Yolanda's family could not save the hay the livestock eats. Even before the wildfires changed this landscape, life here was hard. Families struggling just to make a living are now scrambling to keep their future from turning to ash. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Tabara, Spain.
All right, let's dig into the numbers now. Extreme weather conditions have cost Europe more than $500 billion in the past 4 decades. Germany alone has lost at least $7 billion on average annually in damage over the past 2 decades. Italy estimates each fire costs around $25,000 an acre over a period of 15 years. The government now warns a third of the country's agricultural output is at risk. And France's hydropower output has dropped by 22% in the first half of the year from 2021. Well, it's accepted that heat waves have worsened because of climate change, and scientists have urged governments to take action. Europe unveiled a plan last year to address global warming and cut emissions by 55% by 2030. But despite the pledge to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, many European nations are now burning more coal after Russian gas supplies were reduced. Well, to discuss all of this, I'm joined now by Svenja Seminsky, who is joining us from London. She is the Managing Director of Climate and Sustainability at Marsh McLennan, and she's also a member of the Independent Adaptation Committee that advises the UK government on climate risks. Thank you very much for joining us on Counting the Cost. We've been talking a lot about food insecurity given the war in Ukraine, but what impact is the heat wave, is drought going to have on the continent and the food insecurity going forward?
Well, our global food systems are already under stress, and we see how vulnerable supply and distribution chains are to conflict, political unrest, and also to extreme weather. So you can say it couldn't come at a worse time. A big factor in this is water, and it's worth to note that according to the World Health Organization, by as soon as 2025, half of the world's population will be living in areas impacted by water scarcity. So droughts are already having a big impact on communities, on agriculture, energy and infrastructure. And the economic damages are increasing, and we expect this trend to continue. I think it's really important to understand that while this will have an impact on food prices, food security in Europe is still relatively safe. But we need to also look in a global picture and look at, the implications that these events have around the world. And this just shows how interconnected our world is. And droughts occurring at the same time, actually, across different regions of the planet could actually place an unprecedented strain on our system.
How is the current heat wave affecting energy prices, and how might that impact the transition to renewable energy?
Well, again, the timing is really bad because our energy system is already under a lot of stress, and the current heat wave piles additional challenges on those who are working also hard to make the transition to renewable energy. So we've seen strain on transmission systems, reduction in capacity of nuclear and hydro, surges in energy demand for cooling, and that is pushing up prices. So it comes at a bad time. But at the same time, our economy is well committed to the transition. And we are also seeing progress. For example, renewable energy accounted for more than 80% of the world's new electricity capacity last year. So it's really important that these rates of renewable investment continue to increase. But it is a challenge. And we call this the Trilemma of Energy. So what we need to do is achieve energy security in an affordable and sustainable way. And it is particularly challenging right now, and it brings difficult choices, but it's not taking these measures. It's not really an option because the cost of inaction will be significantly higher.
As you're saying, this is all a reminder about how interconnected everything is. Is this also a reminder of the importance of adaptation and preparedness? And can European countries afford to do that right now, given the risk of recession?
Resilience and adaptation and preparedness should really be seen as an investment and not as a cost, because this is what will keep us going. This will help to keep those future damages and losses at a manageable level. And that's why it is so important to also take action now. So adaptation can mean many things. And the good news is that there are actually technologies and strategies that we can do to ensure that these impacts become more manageable. What we need to do, particularly during these challenging times, where actually, additional investments are so hard to justify, we need to have a positive message saying that investing in nature, in climate change adaptation is a contribution to make our communities and our economy viable.
Absolutely, an investment that our survival kind of depends on. Hey, thank you very much for your time, Svenja Serminski. Appreciate it. Researchers estimate an investment of $800 million in climate programs can save poor nations up to $16 billion every year. That's according to the Global Commission on Adaptation. Rich nations have pledged billions of dollars in climate assistance to developing countries, but many have failed to follow through on their promises. The issue is expected to top the agenda at the climate summit in November. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged wealthy nations to deliver the much needed funds.
Let's get serious about the finance that developing countries need. At a minimum, stop paying lip service to the $100 billion a year pledge. Give clarity through deadlines and timelines and get concrete on its delivery. And let's ensure that those who need funding most can access it.
Rich nations have also pledged $10 billion to the Green Climate Fund, the world's largest project of its kind that has played a crucial role in delivering finance to developing countries. $3 billion were allocated by the US, but the country has only contributed only a third of that so far. Well, joining us now from Munich is Dr. Miranda Scheuers, Chair of Environmental and Climate Policy at the Technical University of Munich. Thank you very much for your time. So extreme weather conditions are not just in Europe. What's the cost then for developing nations?
The costs for developing nations are, of course, huge, in part because developing nations don't have always the same capacity to deal with the droughts and the very heavy rainstorms, the floods, the extreme temperatures that we're increasingly seeing as a result of climate change. Costs range from lost infrastructure to people's health and, of course, the tragic deaths that are also increasingly happening because of climate extremes.
What are some of the low-cost solutions to try and fight global warming and to, see less of these extreme weather events?
Well, I think actually we're at a point where everything we do matters. It really makes a difference whether or not people avoid using their car and instead walk or take a bicycle or use public transportation. Planting a tree can help. Reducing the amount of energy you use at home, taking things that are in standby modus and taking them out of the plug, that can also make a difference. Taking a shorter shower can make a difference. We're actually seeing in Germany right now, because of the war in the Ukraine, a big push to save on energy. And it's remarkable how much energy saving has been achieved just in a couple of months. And if we were to do this at a global level, it could really make an impact.
What about financing and helping poorer nations to make the transition to renewable energy? I mean, rich nations have fallen well short of the $100 billion pledge that was made. Do you expect to see any progress at the next climate summit?
I hope so. In 2019, we were getting about 80 billion of that 100 billion per year, but it's still far too little. Even the 100 billion a year is not enough to deal with the huge impacts of climate change. I do expect that in Egypt, partly because the next COP will be in Egypt, a stronger focus on the developing countries and their needs, and that's very welcome. I think there's a lot of things that can be done, also linking climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And renewable energy will be a big, big help in this area. But we do need the financing to help developing countries shift away from developing coal or oil or gas and instead developing renewables, moving forward on energy efficiency, replanting forests that have been deforested. We really need to be working together.
Speaking of finance, Europe is among the biggest contributors to climate finance for developing nations. Can it follow through, though, amid all of the economic uncertainty that there is right now?
That's a big and important question. I expect that with the costs of COVID, then we've had the war, energy prices are increasing. Budgets will get tighter in Europe. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, renewable energy is getting much, much cheaper than it used to be. We're also seeing that taking action now reduces costs later. So I do hope that Europe will continue to be a big financer and will also focus attention on, for example, you speak of financing, we need to shift the banks away from financing projects that are coal or gas intensive and instead focus on those kinds of investments that will still bring us the energy we need and still bring us the comfort we want, but do it in a cleaner way.
What about the role of the US? I mean, it's failed to meet its green climate obligations. Climate measures are stalling in Congress, and President Biden has just announced a multi-billion-dollar plan to try and fight climate change, but it won't declare it an emergency. So what do you make of the role of the US right now?
Yeah, the US is definitely a divided country at the moment. And unfortunately, we don't seem to have the willingness in the United States to work across party lines on what is, from my perspective, the world's biggest problem right now. Climate change is impacting absolutely everything. My hope is that in the United States, people are starting to wake up. I think you are seeing in that country more interest in or concern about climate change. But we also need to continue to work with or without the United States on making transitions. What is hopeful is that we're seeing this big push for offshore wind right now, also in the United States. And that's partly because this is becoming one of the cheapest technologies around. So one hope is that economics will help to make some of this transition a little bit easier. But it is a big concern. The United States is still responsible for 14% of global CO2 emissions. And without the United States as a big player and a big financer, it will be worrisome.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for time. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Miranda Sherris.
Thank you.
Planes were grounded for months during the pandemic, but air travel is steering the industry's recovery with an increase in demand for new aircraft. Despite the encouraging signs, aviation groups are worried that geopolitical tensions, rising inflation, and a shortage of commodities could drag down the market. American plane maker Boeing forecasts slower growth for deliveries in the long term. The company trimmed projected demand for airplanes over the next 20 years to more than 41,000 new airplanes. That excludes estimates from the Russian market because of the war in Ukraine. The airplane maker forecasts a market value of more than $7 trillion for new airplane deliveries, with the global fleet increasing by 80% through 2041 compared to 2019. Asian markets account for roughly 40% of long-term global demand for new airplanes, while Europe and North America each account for just over 20% of the deliveries. Boeing also trimmed its forecast for annual passenger traffic growth to 3.8%, down from 4%. Well, aviation recovery heated up at the world's second biggest air show at Farnborough in the UK. The industry has been under pressure to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and aerospace manufacturers decided to focus on the future of clean flying at the biannual exhibition. Rory Challens reports.
The gulf between vision and reality rarely yawns as wide as at trade shows. At Farnborough, air travel is green, high-tech, hassle-free. In the real world, queues stretch, baggage piles up and pilots strike.
Sculpted for speed and safety. Engineered for a sustainable future.
But if we're to glimpse how we might fly tomorrow, it is at Farnborough. Boom Supersonic wants to bring back supersonic air travel 2 decades after Concorde was grounded.
We deeply believe in a future where more people can go more places more often. We believe that speed enables that future. And therefore, it's not good enough just to make a little bit of progress on efficiency. We need to make a big leap forward and completely remove sustainability as a reason not to travel.
And hybrid air vehicles is making the Airlanders. Part airship, part plane, part helicopter. It's low emissions, won't need a runway, and would carry passengers or freight.
It's a landscape developing here, isn't there, with developments towards implementation of sustainable aviation fuels, the ongoing efficiency improvements that we get from jet aircraft, and a move to hydrogen, which is a part of our story here and our plan here to bring hydrogen-powered aviation into the mix. And we need all of it. We need all of it, and we need more.
The UK government has just launched Jet Zero, requiring domestic aviation and airports to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2040. Other governments are moving too. COVID was an earthquake for the aviation industry, with air travel all but shutting down. The current staff shortages and disruptions show that aftershocks are still reverberating and may continue into 2023, according to air bosses. Add in the need to minimise how polluting aviation is, and these are turbulent times for the industry. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera, the Farnborough Air Show.
Joining us from London is Rob Morris, Global Head of Consultancy at Ascend by Cirium, a consultancy service that delivers data on aviation and air travel. Just the man we need on the show. Thank you very much for joining us, Rob. So Boeing has struck an upbeat tone on aircraft demand despite a faltering global economy. What's your take on the rise in demand for aircraft?
Yeah, I think we need to differentiate short-term versus long-term. So Boeing released its commercial market outlook last week, which covers a forecast of in excess of 40,000 new aircraft deliveries over the next 20 years. That's the long term. But of course, at the present time, the industry is still recovering from the impact of COVID on demand. And in some regions, in fact, in all regions, we're either close to 2019 in demand terms or still some way off. So, but that means there is an increase in demand over where we were 1-2 years ago. And in that context, we see airlines needing more new aircraft, either to replace aircraft that they've withdrawn from service because they're less efficient, or to facilitate the increase in services as growth returns again. As I say, that's the short term. In the long term, we have a forecast at Ascend by Cirium, which is very similar to Boeing's forecast or Airbus's own global market forecast. And we're all forecasting requirements for around 40,000 new commercial passenger jets and freighters to be delivered over the next 20 years. One final point to make, at Farnborough this week, we've seen some aircraft orders, but fewer aircraft orders than we would have seen at previous trade shows, around 250 firm orders between Airbus and Boeing. But that's because right now Airbus is sitting on a backlog for new aircraft of nearly 7,000 aircraft units, and Boeing nearly 5,000 units. So between them, from that 40,000 demand, we've already got around 12,000 new aircraft committed and on firm order today.
Boeing's estimate, which we've been talking about, excludes Russian planes. How much do you think the war in Ukraine is affecting the market?
Russia and Ukraine were a relatively small part of the market overall. In passenger traffic terms, we measure passenger traffic in terms of the distance people travel. We call them revenue passenger kilometers. And that was around 4% of the global market. So in overall terms, Russia was around 4%. And if you look at Boeing's forecast, I think they talked about there being 1,540 aircraft from their 40-odd thousand. So even fewer of those were new aircraft. But an interesting point, this is a long-term forecast. In 20 years, that market for 1,540 aircraft will exist, and somebody will be able to access it, whether it be just Russian manufacturers or whether in the long term things change and other people can supply again. We don't know, because if we think back 20 years, the market was very different. So Russia, about 4% of the market. We're seeing a limited impact on traffic in demand in Europe today. One final point though, Russia was a market where lessors, that's people, companies who purchase aircraft and then lend them for a rent to airlines. Russia was a big market for operating lessors, getting on for 10% of the overall market. So the loss of that market changes the way that industry can operate going forward, because they've lost a bigger chunk of their demand.
Sure. What has the impact been, if any, from supply chain disruptions, deliveries and sort of access to spare parts?
So at the present time, if you talk to any airlines or other customers, they will typically tell you that the manufacturers are 3-4 months or more late with deliveries. Clearly, supply chain disruption, both in the context of access to materials, access to people, and logistics for delivery to the OEMs, the manufacturers' final assembly lines, is disrupted.
The industry as a whole is facing many challenges. I mean, we've seen, chaos at airports, labour shortages, luggage not being able to be found or unloaded, high ticket prices. Do you think any of this is going to affect the rebound in travel? And how can the industry, or how soon can the industry make up for the pandemic losses?
Yeah, I think that there is a potential for a lot of this to impact the pace of the recovery. So if we look at our own projection models, we had global recovery to 2019 levels occurring by about August of next year. But as we look at, first of all, the chaos itself being fomented by the lack of human capital, the fact that many people have left the industry and haven't returned, that's causing significant disruption. Then we look at the economic outlook with high inflation, driving increasing fuel price for airlines, driving potentially increased maintenance costs for airlines, driving the cost of that they actually pay to own or lease their aircraft up, driving their staff to seek higher pay rises. That's all going to create higher costs for airlines, which effectively will get passed through to us, the passengers, in higher ticket prices. And we know that when we see higher ticket prices, that potentially dampens demand. Then we also have slower economic growth potentially. If we look at GDP forecast moving forward, we see many people projecting slowdowns, or maybe even contractions of economies, recessions in the fourth quarter, first quarter next year. Slower economic growth could also dampen demand. So that means the rebound, the recovery outlook becomes more uncertain.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, Rob Morris.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Kim Vanel, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kim Vanel from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.